I merely showed them the truth, tearing them from the pointless cycle of life and death. From illusion to awakening, decay to rebirth, terror of impermanence to liberation. They need not tremble before humanity, nor mourn their end. Released from the shackles of life, they can step into true eternity. The 936th time. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whisper.
Happy April Fools! Today I decided that I would actually go through and make a video analyzing and dissecting really the meaning, the analysis, and the techniques behind The Hollow Men, which is one of my personal favorite poems. It's the poem that Phrolova quotes both within her Resonator Showcase as well as also within her story, and it's one of my favorite poems by T.S. Eliot. So before we begin, I would just like to say, if you are actually using this video as an educational resource, I'm honored. And also, I'll be putting a timestamp on the screen, so if you want to begin with the poem poetry analysis, get straight to it, I'll be more than happy for you to just go there. But besides that, I just decided a little bit of an April Fool's joke, I suppose. I usually do, of course, Wuthering Waves symbolism content and stuff like that, but it's the April Fool's, decided to go through the Hollow Men, and I suppose it's a bit of an educational prank, right? You know, going through one of my favorite poems, and also one that Kuro has directly quoted with Frolova. So, if you are one of my Wuthering Waves watchers, I hope you do enjoy this analysis, even though it's all probably not up your alley. Maybe you can kind of also see why Kuro picked this poem and the last stanza of it specifically for Frolova. Because I did go through this within my Phrolova video, but this poem, once you fully understand it, has so many parallels towards Phrolova as a character and Phrolova's story. I think it's really amazing. Let's get on with the analysis. Before we actually go through and talk about the Hollow Men within its entirety, I think I want to go through three key concepts. The first concept is a psychological concept by this French psychologist called Émile Durkheim, and he coined a term called anomie. Anomie is a state or state of mind where nothing is normal. And what results from that, because you see around you in your world, nothing is normal, everything is changing, you feel very apathetic and you feel very disconnected with the world, with other people. And the reason why I talk about anomie is because modernist poetry, like for example T.S. Eliot, you know, like Ezra Pound and stuff like that, as well as also just modernist literature in general, like you can look at, for example, Virginia Woolf's Miss Dalloway. One thing that you really see from that is that there is a very unique modernist sentiment of fragmentation, of destruction, of tradition, of this feeling of disconnection, apathy, and I don't really have any word to describe it except for Durkheim's anomie. So we're going to talk a lot about modernist sentiment because a lot of Eliot's poetry, of course, reflects that, right? It is a reflection of modernism and this idea of the failure of the human spirit, of the failure of tradition, of the failure of language, for example. So that's anomie, right? The second thing I want to talk about is a concept called liminality. Liminality is very simply the state of being between two things. And it is going to be basically one of the core mechanics, let's just call it, behind this poem. If you don't understand liminality, you can't understand this poem. So that's liminality. The third thing, which I'm sure if you're religious you may know, is purgatory. Purgatory is this sort of spiritual realm that you go to in a lot of religions after you die. And after you die, you go into purgatory, and purgatory is almost kind of like this waiting room, right? It's a waiting room for when you actually die for real and like go to heaven or something. And because of that, purgatory is a very liminal concept. Purgatory is between life or death. Like when you die, you haven't actually truly died yet. You go to purgatory, right? Before you can actually die for real. So it's a liminal concept. It resides between life and death. And specifically speaking, what Eliot references a lot within this poem is Dante Alighieri's version of Purgatory within his Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is going to be referenced a lot. So Dante's Divine Comedy, specifically Purgatorio, is going to be talked about a lot. So you guys know these three things now. So you have anomie, you also have liminality, and then purgatory. So now we can actually go and start deconstructing this poem, because it is a very layered poem. A lot of the lines have a lot of different meanings, and I want to put a bit of a disclaimer that this analysis, right, is purely subjective. A lot of like interpretations and analysis is subjective, and it's really just how I look at it. I'm not trying to, of course, like steal Eliot's thunder, like, or assume what he's trying to mean with his poetry. In fact, Eliot was quite well known for calling it out when people try to analyze the wasteland. But at the end of the day, it's my interpretation, and it is my hope that either you find this really interesting and you kind of like understand why I like this poem so much and maybe perhaps read more of T.S. Eliot, or if you are actually using this as an educational resource, then you can, of course, understand the poem better, right? So Eliot's poem begins with two lines. Mr. Kurtz, he dead, a penny for the old guy. And this is two references in two lines. Mr. Kurtz, he dead is a reference to Joseph Conrad's book, The Heart of Darkness. And within The Heart of Darkness, Kurtz is a ivory trader, right? And he starts going into the Congo, selling ivory and stuff like that, becoming immensely rich. And he begins acting like a god amongst the local natives. And the reason why Eliot references Mr. Kurtz like this is because Kurtz is a model for someone who is morally bankrupt, who is a disgustingly hollow and empty person. And that is going to be a recurring theme throughout this entire poem. So that's that. The second reference is a penny for the old guy. So this is a reference to Guy Fawkes. So if you guys didn't know, Guy Fawkes was a person who was very like the ringleader of the gunpowder plot. The gunpowder plot was a plan to plant a bomb under the English Parliament to kill King James. You would know a lot about it if you studied Shakespeare's Macbeth, for example, but Guy Fawkes, right, he failed in his plan, and every year in Britain, they celebrate something called Guy Fawkes' Day, where they burn effigies of Guy Fawkes. And these like straw effigies, these like fake empty humans, is going to be a recurring theme. The Hollow Men, right? Going to be a recurring theme. But the penny for the old guy is a reference to how on Guy Fawkes' Day, kids would buy fireworks to celebrate the celebration for a penny, right? So it's a penny for the old guys, a penny for Guy Fawkes. And Guy Fawkes on this day is an empty effigy. So when we go through the first stanza, we are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. So we begin this poem with the overarching metaphor for the entire text, right? Which is the hollow men. The hollow men that Eliot tries to describe is not just a physical sort of like straw scarecrow of like a person, but also this metaphor for what he thinks about the people around him, right? One of the things I talked about at the beginning was the concept of anomie, this idea that people were emotionless, they were lost, and because of that, Eliot believed that they were kind of spiritually empty, right? They were like scarecrows. They had external appearances, but inside there was nothing. They were filled with straw. That's why they say, for example, headpiece filled with straw, lean together, because it manifests like an image of scarecrows, right? And he even confirms that, for example, our dried voices, because they're scarecrows, they're made of straw. We whisper together, are quiet and meaningless. So this idea that, because of course scarecrows can't talk. When they whisper, there's no sound. And this is going to be a bit of a recurring theme, because one of the big things that Eliot talks about is the failure of language within this poem. Just like how a lot of traditional constructs within modernism, like religion, like for example, a lot of traditional constructs within modernism are failing, like religion, like family, like relationships are failing, language is also something that fails. So one of the things that's going to happen a lot is Eliot is going to kind of characterize these straw people as failing to talk with one another. And then we follow this first stanza as winds in dry grass or rats' feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. So this is of course just very disgusting auditory imagery. Rats' feet over broken glass is a horrifying kind of sound, and that's the point. Eliot is trying to essentially communicate an environment which feels apocalyptic, feels like the end of the world, right? And when he says in our dried cellar, Eliot turns this whole experience of being straw men, of hollow men, into something that is affecting all of us, right? In our dry cellar. It's a universal human experience in a sense. And then he continues and says, shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. And this is a really interesting two lines because when you get all four of these things, these things are functionally impossible, right? How on earth can you have a shape without form? That just doesn't happen. You can't have a shade without color. You can't be a force but be paralyzed at the same time. You can't gesture without motion. And that's the point. Eliot is trying to say that the human condition, when people are hollow, right? They have external experiences, but they're spiritually empty and dead inside, is similarly like this, an impossible kind of experience of, it's an impossible state of being. But he's pushing forward this idea that that's just what it is, right? And he says, continues in this first stanza, those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom. And death's other kingdom in this section is purgatory. And this is where Dante's Divine Comedy, specifically Purgatorio and Purgatory, begin to come in. Because death's other kingdom, right? The kingdom you reach before death is purgatory. And then he continues, remember us, if not at all, not as lost, violent souls, but only as a hollow men, the stuffed men. And this idea of how these souls, right, these like hollow men, are basically effectively stuck in purgatory is a very haunting image. Because what Eliot is really trying to say here is that these are the people wandering purgatory, unable to die, right? They're halfway between life and death. And Eliot basically characterizes this condition of humanity, of anomie that we talked about before, as almost being a half-dead state, of effectively being in some sort of spiritual purgatory. So much so that he basically refers to it as death's other kingdom, which is a link to Dante's Inferno, right? And then we go on to the second stanza. Eyes I dare not meet in dreams. One of the things that you're going to see a lot is that eyes within the Hollow Men symbolically represents divine oversight. So for example, when you think about, eyes, like eyes are oftentimes linked towards, like biblical angels and stuff like that. So eyes is kind of like this idea of divine oversight. And Eliot is saying that he basically, when he says, eyes I dare not meet in dreams, he doesn't dare face God, right? He doesn't dare face the divine. And the hollow men are still, in death's dream kingdom, right? Within purgatory. And what he's saying when they say, these do not appear, right? God does not watch purgatory. There is no divine oversight within purgatory. The straw men, the hollow men left within purgatory are all alone. They cannot connect to God. And then he says here, there the eyes are, and we talked about already what the eyes mean, and symbolizes divine oversight. There the eyes are sunlight on a broken column. And this is really interesting because sunlight on a broken column, the way I interpreted this is that the broken column is symbolic of the greatness of humanity, right? When you think about, for example, columns, like you think about the golden ages of Greek and Roman architecture, the greatest birthplaces of Western civilization and stuff like that. But the fact that these columns are broken essentially connotes that human civilization is breaking, it's fading, it's ending. And that is something that is going to be talked about a lot within the other parts of the poem. So you just need to hold on for a moment because it's going to make sense a bit later. So sunlight on a broken column, right? The eyes are like sunlight, right? They're very superficial. They look upon these broken columns, but they can't do anything. They can't do anything for humanity because humanity is spiritually dead. It's too far gone. There is a tree swinging and the voices in a wind singing is this idea, in my opinion, of the beauty of nature, of this abandonment of humanity. Because as we said before, this whole environment that Eliot is conjuring up in his poem is apocalyptic. It's the end of the human species because we have died spiritually, right? And then it says, more distant and more solemn than a fading star. And this is kind of like this idea that these sounds, this beautiful natural imagery, right? It's gone. It's not here anymore. It's more distant and solemn than a fading star. And this fading star specifically, in my opinion, I think Eliot is referring to the Star of Bethlehem, who in the Bible the three kings followed to get to the birth of Jesus. And the reason why I say this is because within Eliot's other poetry, specifically The Journey of the Magi, he actually specifically refers to this star. So it's something that he likes to refer to a lot, the Star of Bethlehem. And then we can kind of continue to the second half of the second stanza. Let me be no nearer in death's dream kingdom. And we know here again, death's dream kingdom, right, is actually not purgatory. Because purgatory is, if you kind of see here, death's other kingdom. So what is death's dream kingdom? Where is it that people dream to go of after they die? They dream of going to heaven. And this again is a bit of a reference to Dante's Divine Comedy with Paradiso, right? Paradiso is death's dream kingdom. It's where people who are stuck in purgatory wish to go to. Because once you ascend Mount Purgatory and clear all the levels, you end up in heaven. That's what happens to Dante. And basically he kind of says that, you know, in order to go into Death's dream kingdom, he must wear disguises. Like, he would not be allowed to enter heaven as a hollow man, as someone who is spiritually dead, like, you know, like a scarecrow, right? And he can, like, basically connotes this, like, very satirically by saying rat's coat, crow skin, cross staves. And these are all very disgusting images of things you would put on a scarecrow. Again, this metaphor of the hollow man, right? And he's saying in a field behaving as the wind behaves, right? Basically saying that these scarecrows, the hollow men, are basically almost like stuck in a field. They don't move. They behave as the wind behaves. The wind pushes them and then they move. They don't have any independence or agency because they have no spirituality and they have no free will of their own. And it says, no nearer, not that final meeting in the Twilight Kingdom. So he's saying that, you know, no nearer, he's never going to get nearer to Death's Dream Kingdom. He's never going to heaven, right? And instead, the final meeting place for these hollow men is a Twilight Kingdom. What is the Twilight Kingdom, you may ask? The Twilight Kingdom is purgatory. The reason why we know this is because of liminality. Just like how purgatory is a state between life and death, twilight is also a liminal concept. It's the time between day and night. So because of that, we know that every time Eliot says the Twilight Kingdom, it's a reference to purgatory. So again, we kind of like go on to the third stanza here. This is the dead land, this is the cactus land. And the dead land and the cactus land is basically just very apocalyptic imagery. I don't think they really mean anything, but the next line is very figuratively charged. So when he says, here are the stone images. The stone images within the hollow men is this idea of these religious icons that humanity builds, like statues and temples and, you know, like other iconography, right? That these humans, like these spiritually dead humans, hold up and pay reverence to. But in the end, they are just objects. They're just stone images. They have no divinity or emotion behind them. Just like the hollow men that revere them, they are empty. And they say here, here they are raised, here they receive the supplication of a dead man's hand. So if you guys don't know, supplication, as a TLDR, I suppose, is basically just a very feverish or like strong prayer. And when they say these stone images receive the supplication of a dead man's hand, what do you guys think is a dead man? The dead man is a hollow man, right? The hollow men are trying to pay reverence to these stone images. They're trying to believe in religion even though they're spiritually dead, even though, of course, they're too far gone. They're never going to heaven, right? The stone images, they receive their prayer, but it's under the twinkle of a fading star. And what is the fading star that we talked about before? It's most likely the Star of Bethlehem, right? And then Eliot continues saying, is it like this in Death's other kingdom? Is it like this in purgatory, right? In purgatory, you wake alone at an hour when we are trembling with tenderness, right? That Eliot's saying that when these people go to purgatory, the spiritually dead, hollow men go to purgatory, it's too late. They try to pretend that they are alive, but it's too late. You're already in purgatory. You're never going to heaven. You're never going out, right? And he finally finishes with lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone. And this idea that, again, they want this emotion after they've lost it, right? They're in purgatory, they're spiritually dead, and all of a sudden they want all these emotions and spirituality, but it's gone, right? And instead, these lips that would kiss, they form prayers to broken stone. And what is the stone? The stone is the stone images that Eliot mentioned earlier in the stanza, talking about this fact that they're praying to these religious icons that themselves lack meaning. So they form prayers to broken stone, but it's too late. It's all too late. They're already in purgatory. They've already lost all spirituality. And then we go on to the fourth stanza, and this is really just where the whole symbolism of eyes gets confirmed. Because we said before that eyes are a reference to divine oversight, the eyes of God, God looking down on mortals. What Eliot says is that, the eyes are not here. There are no eyes here. In this spiritually dead world that resembles purgatory, there is no divine oversight. God has abandoned humanity. In this valley of dying stars, again, this dying stars connotes this very apocalyptic image of destruction, of the end of humanity, right? In this hollow valley, again, this terrible imagery, this broken jaw of our lost kingdoms. And again, if you guys remember from the very beginning, there was this kind of like mention here with eyes and the death of civilizations, of kingdoms, right? The earlier mention here was when they said, sunlight on a broken column, right? The eyes do not appear over here, right? There is no, like, this broken column resembles this symbolic link to the birthplace and the greatest points of Western civilization with Greece and Rome, but there's sunlight on a broken column. Just like that, it's the broken jaw of our lost kingdoms, right? And within this terrible, apocalyptic, world-ending place that resembles purgatory, Eliot says, in this last of meeting places, we grope together and avoid speech, right? These hollow men, they grope together, but they can't talk. As we said before, communication within modernism is something that just fails spectacularly, right? Communication just fails, and we're going to talk about that more. But I want to talk about this line in particular. Gathered on this beach of the Tumen River. And this is a reference to either the river Styx or the river Acheron within Greek mythology. And this very famously was taken to within Dante's Inferno, within his Divine Comedy, the Hell sequence Inferno, because Dante and Virgil have to cross the river Styx or the river Acheron. And the really interesting thing about this is that this comes from Greek myth, where the river Styx is a river you have to cross before you enter the underworld. And very famously, you had to pay the ferryman Charon a silver obol to row you across. But one thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is that the other thing that you had to forfeit before you cross this river was all of your worldly possessions. And a lot of people refuse to do that, refuse to cross the river, give up what they had in life. So instead of crossing, they would stay on the shores of the river Styx or the river Acheron, depending on what version of the myth you're kind of like reading. But this idea of being stuck on the other shore of the river, being unable to enter the underworld, enter death, is the exact same idea that Eliot has been talking about this whole time with purgatory, right? It's gathered on this beach of the Tumen River. And again, we're sightless until the eyes reappear, right? Again, this idea of divine oversight. The people, these hollow men, they're blind unless divine oversight, unless God reappears, right? As the perpetual star is, in my opinion, basically this idea of God. And then the reason why I think that the perpetual star is God is because he later says multifoliate rose. And multifoliate rose is a reference to, again, Dante's Divine Comedy, but this time within Paradiso, the heaven sequence, right? When Dante reaches the highest level of heaven called the Empyrean, he sees something that he calls the divine rose, and it's a circle of angels that surround God. And this divine rose is really what Eliot is talking about with the multifoliate rose. It's the dream. It's the highest level of heaven that all of these people in purgatory wish to have. And the reason why we know that is because within Death's Twilight Kingdom, within purgatory that we talked about, this multifoliate rose, the highest level of heaven, is the hope only of empty men. So we then go on to the fifth section, and this kind of section, this nursery rhyme, here we go round the prickly pear, all that sort of stuff, is actually a parody of a famous nursery rhyme called Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. But the thing that Eliot changes here is that instead of the mulberry bush, he talks about the prickly pear. Why does he do that? Because the prickly pear is a plant that only grows in the desert. And as we talked about before, this whole poem has been really emphasizing this apocalyptic environment of the doom of the world, doomsday, the end of the world. So the prickly pear, instead like this parody where he replaces the mulberry bush with the prickly pear, is actually very fitting. And then we go kind of like here, right? Between the idea and the reality, between the emotion and the act, forms a shadow. This whole section here, right, of all of this stuff is very interesting. There's two moving components with this. There's going to be a lot of pairs between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, right? This is where the kind of concept of liminality, the state of being between two things, really falls into place. Because these two things, right, are two states of being, or two states really. And in between all these two states, idea, reality, motion, act, falls the shadow. And the shadow is this liminal space that the hollow men are stuck in, right? Between the conception and creation, between the emotion response, falls a shadow, all that sort of stuff. It's a basic comment on liminality and how the hollow men, they're stuck in this kind of purgatory, this liminal purgatory between these two things. They're stuck in the shadow, right? And interspersed between these stanzas, there is lines of the Lord's Prayer, right? And one of the things I talked about earlier in the poem is that one of the really big themes of modernism is the failure of tradition, of the failure of things like religion, which we already saw within this poem, and also the failure of stuff like language. Language fails. And Eliot kind of like does this within the Lord's Prayer when he says, "For thine is the kingdom, life is very long, for thine is the kingdom," and he ends this whole section by saying, "For thine is, life is, for thine is." Just like how the hollow men tried to raise lips to kiss broken stone, like broken religious idols, Eliot is trying to say that at this point, communication has failed, language has failed so substantially that they can't even repeat the Lord's Prayer properly, right? And there's one more thing here you might kind of like find interesting as a reference. One of these liminal states that Eliot describes between the motion and the act is actually a reference to Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And this is a line that is spoken by Brutus. So Brutus was one of the traitors that killed Caesar. Before he actually underwent the assassination, he was kind of doubting himself. And the reason why I bring this up is because when we talk about all the references within this poem, like Dante's Divine Comedy, all these other references to, like, for example, Guy Fawkes, Joseph Conrad, and stuff like that, it's really interesting that within Dante's Divine Comedy, in the Hell sequence, otherwise known as Dante's Inferno, at the very end of Hell, the last thing that Dante sees before he enters Purgatory is the vision of Satan on the last level of hell. And Satan within Dante's Inferno is a three-headed beast, and in each of these three heads, Dante has placed three of the biggest traitors of humanity that he believes. So within the middle, you have Judas, the one who betrayed Jesus, and then on either side of Judas, you have Cassius and Brutus, the two people that betrayed and killed Julius Caesar. And I find it's really interesting that Eliot quotes Shakespeare's Julius Caesar here, specifically a line from Brutus within the play, because considering all the references he's made, I think that this was a conscious decision, but again, this is a bit of a tenable link. So, as I said before, all of this is subjective, this is how I look at it. You can kind of take this as you will, right? But let's move on to the last stanza, the very famous last stanza, that if you're still watching, if any of the people that watch me for Wuthering Waves are still watching, this is the final stanza that Phrolova quotes. This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. And what Eliot really means with this final stanza is that all this time within this poem, he's been trying to almost diagnose this lack of spirituality, this like disgusting psyche of humanity that he's observing, where people are pretending to be alive. They're hollow men, they're scarecrows, they have external experiences, appearances, but are empty inside. And if people keep going this way, then the world is going to end, right? And what Eliot's saying in this last stanza is that when the world really ends, it's not going to end with some massive, like cataclysmic, apocalyptic event. It's going to be a slow burn, a slow death, as our souls are going to die before our physical bodies. That's the kind of image that Eliot is trying to portray within the context of the modernist movement of what was happening in the aftermath of World War I. He was observing during his time. And that really brings us to the end of the Hollow Man. So if you managed to stick along all this time, I really want to thank you. This is one of my favorite poems. So I did want to I always wanted to make a video on this, really. And especially because Kuro was really quoting this with Phrolova. Hopefully if you are a Wuthering Waves player, you were able to see how Frolova's story and character matches with so much of Eliot's messaging within his poem. But besides that, hopefully you guys all enjoyed this video. This was a bit of an April Fool's joke, tricked you guys into studying poetry instead of learning about Wuthering Waves a little bit, I suppose. But if you guys unironically enjoy this poetry analysis and want me to do more, make sure to let me know in the comments. And if you have any questions about the poem or anything else, feel free to put in the comments as well. But besides that, hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.